In the previous episodes, we navigated the big politics. But how does Cambodia work on the ground? Dysfunctional random as it is, this place still functions somehow. Otherwise, it wouldn't have made it into top 20 fastest growing economies for 2 decades in a row. In this region, as many as 50% of all people lived way below the poverty line in 1990. In Cambodia, the figure was even higher than that, with estimates varying from 55 to as high as 70%, mostly as a result of Pol Pot and the 11-year period when the country was not recognized. More recently, statisticians have developed an index of what is called multidimensional poverty, which attempts to measure the experience of multiple disadvantages that go beyond a lack of income. The assumption behind this is that poverty is not just about a lack of money, but also includes deprivations in various other aspects of life, such as health, education, and living standards more broadly. By this index, in 2014, 36.7% of Cambodians were in a state of multidimensional poverty. By 2022, which is a few months prior to the filming of this footage, only 16% of Cambodians were classified as living in a state of multidimensional poverty. Halving the number of poor people by means of capitalism is, for all intents and purposes, a success story. But how does that success feel like on the ground? And why isn't this offered up as an example more often? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the 8th featured installment of the Khmer series. So, whenever stats are brought up, it is reasonable to ask how disconnected those statistics are from reality and what is their bias, regardless of whether it's an intentional bias or not. This is why here on Freedom Alternative we insist on going on the ground as much as possible to attempt to test things. So in the case of Cambodia, the stats say the country has been improving rapidly, while the government complains that it simply can't do the main project that both the regional actors, which is a fancy way of saying China, and the IMF would want, which is de-dollarization. In previous episodes, I mentioned that the main obstacle is the Khmer people themselves. Ironically, this explanation, although self-evidently true as you can see in the footage where all prices are displayed only in US dollars, this is also the only explanation that is not thoroughly explored by think tanks, official reports, and other documents read by policy wonks and other spreadsheet type of people. This happens not just because of the inherent bias of the spreadsheet people, be them Westerners or Chinese, but also because modernity assumes that simple things can't be that simple, thus leading analysis, reading, and life itself to drown in a sea of verbiage. But in Cambodia, things are indeed pretty simple. Nearly everyone uses the US dollar and they never think twice about it. This can be shocking for some of the visitors, especially the visitors from anti-cash countries or regions where math skills are in short supply. In one of the days, I was queuing at a store to buy some cigarettes, and in front of me was a Dutchman who bought stuff worth $17. His card was obviously declined, more on that later, and so he pulled out a $50 bill and the clerk gave him back $30 and 12,000 real. The clerk didn't speak much English, so I took the role of Good Samaritan to explain to the Dutchman that he isn't being double-crossed. It's just how things work here. Anything lower than $5 is handled in the local currency at the median rate of 4,000 real for $1 US. So he got $30 and another $3 in the local currency. That's perfectly normal. Welcome to Cambodia. Well, I still needed to write it down for him because, as I routinely observe, more and more young people today in some Western countries are straight up incapable of doing basic arithmetic on the spot. I have plenty of such stories from the US, Sweden, the Low Countries, as well as areas that have bought into the illiberal project of not using cash. Cambodia, however, is not one such place. Quite the opposite. By refusing card payments, they maintain the trust of both visitors and local customers because there is no suspicion of fraud. You have to remember that fraud is very common here, especially by the Chinese. No, seriously, do not use an electronic payment method in a Chinese establishment anywhere in Indochina. Just don't. But in addition to maintaining a moderate level of trust, Cambodians are also actively keeping more for themselves, which incidentally is the main reason the country has been halving its poverty rate every 7 or 8 years. But what's truly fascinating is that none of this is thought of as ideological. Very few people I asked have ever thought about just how rare or effective this is. That is the beauty of freedom after all. It just works. But in the realm of payments, the barrier of entry is arithmetic, but also patience. Just a different kind of patience. Because one downside of this is the common annoyance of having your bills rejected. I had a $50 bill that was rejected in a place as potentially fake, in another place as too deteriorated, and the exact same bill deemed just fine through the paranoid verification system of the state bank in Laos. So, trade-offs. You can lead a fully untraceable life here, and it's by design and wide agreement, but make sure you have a lot of small bills and be prepared to have some of them rejected in some places routinely for ridiculous reasons. The good news is that in the cities there are ATMs that dispense US dollars, much to the desperation of the government. In fact, it was the government that tried to sell the story that the use of US dollars runs the risk of counterfeit currency. Now, of course, some of that risk is real. However, it was and is not big enough to warrant a change. Now, that's not my opinion. It's the obvious revealed preference of the Khmer people over decades. And this preference forces a whole plethora of practices that are, for all intents and purposes, anarcho-capitalist in nature. While in Europe youth unemployment is a huge issue, this simply isn't the case here. In terms of ease of finding a job, Cambodia is in top 10 best countries in the world alongside Singapore, neighboring Thailand, but also the Netherlands and Australia. But unlike the Netherlands or Australia, the range of jobs available here is much wider. Of course, Western socialists like to point out that this means jobs paid with $3 a day. And some of that is true. In the villages purposefully repressed by the government, making $3 a day is a common occurrence. But in most of the country, it's usually much better than that. But what helps the most is the lack of regulations on most things. I met a Spanish guy who was doing bar work here in Siem Reap in the middle of the tourist trap. I presumed that he was doing it for the fun of it and maybe grab some extra cash to extend his stay here. And sure enough, that was part of the reason. But then he dropped a bomb on me and I had to look it up before believing him. It was far easier for this 19-year-old Spaniard to get a job as a bartender on the other end of the planet in Siem Reap, Cambodia, than in his hometown back in Spain. In Spain, just like in many especially Western European countries, it's been made impossible for youngsters to get almost any starter job. A bartender has to have 1 or 2 years of experience, pay for an alcohol license, and attend a class on how to handle alcohol, and have some bullshit hospitality certification to have any chance of being employed in a bar in Barcelona. Not to mention a clean criminal record, which has to be picked up from another bureaucracy, so more hassle, and proof of residence in the city of employment. You're a commuter for another town? Well, sucks to be you. Welcome to Spain. Meanwhile, here, all it took was showing up on time. He didn't even need to speak Khmer, although he was now learning some of that too for the banter. This not only highlights a huge issue that exists in Europe, but also highlights a phenomenon that will keep Cambodia growing. Even the poorest and straight-up illiterate people have a chance of starting out. Of course, there is a downside to this as well. Ordinary life in Cambodia is oftentimes both a hustle and a hassle. The hustling part is, of course, the fact that the informal economy, which employs the vast majority of Cambodians, is very fast-paced and highly competitive. I can think of a lot of special snowflakes in the West, especially the younger ones, who would have a breakdown in a day if they had to work like these people do. Which is why I appreciated that Spaniard a lot more, and probably why the Cambodian bar owner did as well. More than 88% of the labor force works in the informal economy. In 2025, the government had started a slow process of trying to legalize at least some of it. We'll see how that will work out, but we should note that unlike the failed efforts at de-dollarization, with this issue the government is trying to meet the Khmer people where they are and explicitly excludes attempts at rapid formalization on grounds that it, quote, can overwhelm vulnerable micro-entrepreneurs, unquote. That's an astonishing admission, and it's also a very good point. Quite surprising for an authoritarian and otherwise economically illiterate political class. Of course, the reason this approach is attempted is not due to some deep understanding, but due to practicality. You, as an authoritarian government, don't exactly want to piss off 88% of the population. I mean, you can, but it's a bad idea. Because in addition to the hustling lifestyle, which builds the kind of resilience that you don't want turned against you, there are other aspects of Cambodian society that resemble anarcho-capitalism more than an authoritarian state. One of those would be gun ownership. Now, if you look it up online, you will find quote-unquote data that says there are very few civilian weapons and that handling of weapons is illegal in the kingdom. But I will remind you that handling US dollars is technically illegal here as well, or at least was until very recently. Just like everywhere else, there is a gap between what the authority says and what actually happens. And when it comes to direct personal freedoms, the gap is very big in Cambodia. You can also tell that it's an armed society by how polite people are and how low the crime rate is. With the exception of corruption and bribery, which is an absolute necessity in a dysfunctional random place like this one, Phnom Penh ranks better than almost every Western European capital on almost every other metric, and especially on risk of being assaulted, risk of being targeted on ethnic grounds, or risk of being killed. A lot of that is driven by the fact that a lot more than 4% of the populace is armed. The flip side is that while violent crime is very rare, petty crime is quite common, and small accidents. So this is where the hassle part comes in. Your main risk if you're doing what I was doing, regardless of whether you're a local or a visitor, are a collision with one of the many motorbikes or tuk-tuks, or have your wallet stolen or bag snatched. Even that has gotten better in the last 5 years, but it's still a real risk. And as we know from sociology and psychology, there is an inertia, or a lag, if you will, between crime actually dropping and the public perception catching up with that reality. However, the chaotic driving hasn't changed. If anything, it's gotten worse as more people can afford a motorized vehicle, which in turn leads to more accidents. This has happened in every single country, and you can observe it in real time happening in Cambodia as well. It will work itself out eventually, but for the time being, this is a hassle. Still, it's the kind of hassle that allowed me to take footage like this. I'll be missing this place for years to come, but I'll also acknowledge that it's not everyone's cup of tea. Another hassle in the ordinary life here is the constant blackouts, especially if you live in the capital city where 1/5 of the population lives. It happens so often that locals oftentimes don't even think about it that much. They just save up to buy a generator and shrug it off. I caught one such blackout in the middle of the day. When I asked around, most people hadn't even noticed it. The answer from one of the neighbors encapsulated the attitude in general. Well, probably the government is fucking around again. It's rare during daytime, so it's likely going to last. I'm surprised your building doesn't have a generator." Unquote. Fortunately, he was wrong. It lasted for only 1 hour, but the attitude is consistent with the general view and lifestyle here. If you can't provide it yourself, expect to do without, because the government is mostly useless, except when it's the outright enemy. Now, I'm not trying to sell ordinary life in Cambodia as aspirational, but I am saying that there is a thing or two particularly libertarians everywhere could learn from the Khmer people. One more thing that probably has to be said here as well, although we'll go deeper into it in episode 10, is the human trafficking issue. We'll get to the big trends and its history in episode 10, but from the point of view of ordinary life, with the risk of sounding cold, this is definitely or effectively a non-issue. This shouldn't be controversial to say. An issue can be real and serious, like human trafficking in Indochina, Cambodia included, but also a non-issue for the vast majority of the people in that same region. Human trafficking is primarily perpetrated by Chinese and Vietnamese nationals, and the victims are also primarily Vietnamese and Chinese. Cambodia acts as the host primarily because it's easier. Not only due to incompetence and corruption, and some would argue even complicity of the Cambodian government, but it's also easier precisely because Cambodia is a place known for its easiness to get a job. Victims of human trafficking are lured here on fake job postings primarily. This wouldn't work if the country were one in which finding a job was excessively hard. But if you're a regular person from here or a visitor from outside Asia, human trafficking is a very low concern. This is worth mentioning because the internet has been filled with safetyist nonsense that effectively skew perception both ways. So, places like Ireland, which had more cases of human trafficking in the last 5 years than Cambodia, end up being perceived as safer, when the reality is the polar opposite. Be that as it may, there is one facet that human trafficking has been influencing ordinary life, which is telesales and customer support. You won't see automated customer support anytime soon here, and telesales will continue to remain rare. Why? Because the bulk of human trafficking victims relocated to Cambodia do not work in the sex trade, as Amnesty International wrongly claims, but in the scam centers. The general population doesn't know all the intricacies of this and doesn't quite care that much either. But they know enough to instinctively distrust any attempt at selling something over the phone or Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever. This is something that probably more people should pick up as well, but that's a story for another day. Strictly in this context, it's worth noting this fact as another data point for next time you hear some propaganda or panic porn about automation. Just like with many policies and ideas, they can only work if the plebs want them. If the plebs are stubborn or apathetic enough, then no matter how grandiose your project is, it will still fail. And Cambodia is a good example of some of this. The grand ideas of electronic currency, de-dollarization, automation of public life, all of that died and stayed dead when it reached Cambodia, because the Khmer people don't function that way, for better and for worse. So, to sum up, ordinary life in Cambodia is clearly harder than in more developed parts of the world, but significantly easier and indeed more pleasant than the impression one might derive from reading agenda-driven Westoid or Chinese reports. Life here is shockingly chill, even in the villages. Crime is low, and if you're willing to work, you can get ahead. It's not easy, but it is easier than some other countries that enjoy a higher level of prestige. So I'll leave it at that. In the next episode, we'll take a similar look at ordinary life in Laos, and then we'll get to the very controversial stuff about the whole region. Until then, thank you for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and if you like this kind of content, please do consider becoming a member. Videos are made available sometimes months in advance, and members also get exclusive content, a say in how we run things, and much more. And with that, I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.